Airbus and Boeing have been competing head-to-head for decades as the world's largest commercial airplane makers. The European-based Airbus entered the market 56 years after its rival. And today, 76% of the world's fleet is made up of Airbus and Boeing planes. But over the last few years, Airbus has edged out Boeing for market dominance.
Airbus is clearly in the lead, and they have a good lead. And if you just want to measure that, it's by the backlog of the airplanes.
Airbus has made a steady profit since the pandemic, while Boeing hasn't made a profit since 2018. Airbus's total backlog, which are planes that have been ordered but not yet delivered, is 8,726, compared to Boeing's 5,643, which represents billions of dollars in revenue and is estimated to take almost 13 years to complete.
We've gone from back in 1978, where you would hardly ever see an Airbus airplane in the US, to now having well over 50% of the market here in the US.
Since 2019, Airbus has delivered more planes annually than Boeing, which has been dealing with crisis after crisis, including 2 deadly crashes of its best-selling 737 MAX 8, which grounded that aircraft for nearly 2 years. It's also been dealing with significant financial losses, manufacturing issues, and production limitations.
One thing I want to be clear about, Airbus was already winning the race before the MAX ran into trouble because the A321 in general was winning share.
Narrow-bodies make up the majority of the commercial aircraft flying today. These planes are very versatile. They can do multiple short trips a day or cross oceans and continents. Boeing's 737 was the world's best-selling narrow-body until 2019, when Airbus's A320 surpassed it in total orders. And depending on how many planes are delivered in 2025, the A320 could take the reins as the most produced jet family in history.
If you look across the board at the backlogs, and indeed at orders, everything is fine in every category except for the A321, which is absolutely crushing it.
CNBC explores how Airbus came to be the biggest commercial plane manufacturer and whether it can stay on top.
The official 737 christening ceremony took place in the new final assembly building.
In the late 60s, Boeing was dominating the commercial aircraft market. It had just debuted the 737 and the world's first ever wide-body jet, the massive 747. European aerospace companies took notice.
The biggest misconception about Airbus is that it was some sort of instant creation circa 1969. It really wasn't. It was a merger of a number of European national champion aerospace companies that had been building planes since World War II or World War I, and the only way they could do it was by pooling their resources, thus Airbus.
As more people took to the skies, airlines looked to operate bigger aircraft. At the time, all wide-body planes had 3 or 4 engines. For reference, a wide-body typically has 2 aisles, flies longer distances, and can carry anywhere from 250 to 500 passengers, while a narrow-body or single aisle has 1 single aisle through the cabin, flies shorter distances, and can have 100 to 230 seats.
Airbus shows up in the 1970s saying, hey, we have a wide-body plane, but with just 2 engines. And airlines sat up and said, whoa, 2 engines. And obviously, 2 engines that can take you the same distance as 3 are better because your maintenance costs are a lot lower.
In 1972, Airbus introduced the first twin-engine wide-body jetliner, the A300. Despite having only 2 engines, the A300 could only carry around 250 passengers, versus the massive 747, which could be configured to fit over 500.
Not a lot of people saw the need for an intermediate-sized jet, so production rates were 1 or 2 per month for quite a few years.
In 1978, the Deregulation Act was enacted in the U.S., creating more competition, new airlines, and expansion of smaller ones. As airline needs shifted in the 80s, the demand for cost-effective short-haul aircraft grew.
They began to see the need for a new generation single aisle, basically centered around 150 seats.
Airbus had not yet made a profit, and the company needed a plane in its fleet to compete with Boeing's popular narrow-body, the 737, which had already been around since 1967. Airbus launched the A320 single-aisle program in 1984.
The workhorse of the Airbus commercial jet family is the A320. The A320 was one of the few commercial aircraft designed to compete against Boeing's 737 powerhouse and has succeeded where others have failed. Its fuselage is a little bit wider than the 737, and some airlines have taken advantage of that to put in slightly wider seats.
The A320 debuted with a lot of new advanced technology. It was one of the first commercial jets that used a side stick versus yoke controls. This is still a key difference between Airbus and Boeing planes today. It also introduced fly-by-wire controls, meaning when you pull back on the side stick, it sends electronic signals to a computer to move the aircraft, versus a physical cable.
One could argue from a flight controls point of view, the A320 is a generation ahead of the 737. When it first came into the market, it was controversial. Fly-by-wire, when it first came out into the market, was something that was really just used in military airplanes.
The jet's debut, however, ended in a crash during the first demonstration flight at an air show in 1988.
When the A320 was first introduced, it suffered a series of accidents, including some fatal accidents that killed crew and passengers. And that really stalled the public acceptance of the plane.
It took a while there too to get traction, but when it did, well, it succeeded far beyond expectations.
A320 just came into the world 20 years later and has that advantage in terms of just fundamental design differences to the airframe.
By the 1990s, the A320's success would start to put pressure on its U.S. competitors. Airbus, which was backed by European governments, made its first operating profits.
Once Airbus was more market-proven as an aircraft builder, and U.S. airlines started to see the performance results of the Airbus aircraft in other airlines' fleets, they became more open to buying Airbus planes. And it was really the A320 that helped Airbus crack the door open into the US market and many other parts of the world.
Basically, Boeing, through all of this, had 50% of the market. So what you basically had was Douglas, Lockheed, and Airbus duking it out for the other half. Lockheed exited sometime in the mid-'80s, and then everyone knew McDonnell Douglas, matter of time.
In 1997, McDonnell Douglas merged with Boeing, forming the duopoly we know today.
If you think about the evolution of Airbus, Airbus really started in the narrow-body market with no market share, edged out Douglas, and then continued to get share.
The Boeing 737 family and the Airbus A320 family are the company's best-selling planes and have been a crucial segment of competition. The list price for one A321neo is around $129 million. Competition was head-to-head when it came to wide-bodies too. In the 90s, more fuel-efficient twin-engine wide-bodies were introduced. Airbus debuted the A330 and 340, while Boeing introduced its 777.
The A330, they kept refining it at Airbus. It did pretty well. And then Boeing attacked with the 787 Dreamliner. And despite all of the flaws baked into that development program, it did better than the A330 in the long run.
Then from 2003 to 2005, Airbus took more orders and delivered more planes than Boeing.
That 50-50 formula kept persisting, and what Boeing was doing was effectively winning on profitability rather than market share. They were willing to say, all right, we're going to be 50%, but our margins are going to be 9% and yours are going to be 4% or less. It was a formula that worked for them until, of course, the problems with the MAX.
Despite declining sales for four-engine jets, Airbus spent billions creating the biggest double-decker, quad-engine commercial aircraft in the world, and possibly the most identifiable Airbus plane, the A380. It was in service from 2007 until it ended production in 2021.
The A380 is an engineering marvel. Unfortunately, in a way, the A380's success was eclipsed by the success of Airbus's smaller aircraft, namely the A330 family and more recently the A350, which are twin-engine aircraft that can hold 250 to 450 or so passengers and operate ultra-long-range routes.
You looked at Airbus and you thought, wow, you're going to be tied for number one. You might even be number one. The only thing you could do to screw that up is launch a Superjumbo for a market that's going away super fast. And that's exactly what they did. It cost them a decade.
Today, Boeing still dominates the wide-body market with nearly 56% of the global fleet. These aircraft are used for long-haul travel like international flights. Boeing currently has a backlog of over 1,500 wide-body planes. The company has had multiple manufacturing issues with its 787 Dreamliner, and the 777X, which has yet to be certified, is years behind schedule. In 2012, Airbus announced it would begin manufacturing in Mobile, Alabama.
Go back to 1978, and Airbus had a small office here in the US with about a dozen people working there. Roll forward to 2025, and we have a very large manufacturing facility that manufactures airplanes in Mobile, Alabama. We build helicopters in Mississippi. We build satellites in Florida, and actually are present in over 40 locations across the US.
Today, Airbus's biggest customer is Delta Airlines. It has slightly more Airbus planes in its fleet than Boeing.
Airbus has had a different manufacturing strategy than Boeing. Theirs has been more regional. So they have a final assembly plant, a FAL, as they call them, in Asia, one in North America, one in Europe, where Boeing's final assembly has been highly concentrated in North America. China was almost exclusively Boeing customer for many, many years. By having a final assembly line in China, I think Airbus would argue that that helped them get some share in China.
Airbus has been manufacturing in the U.S. for nearly 10 years. It's about to open a third production line, 2 of which are for the 320 family and the other for its smaller 220 jets it acquired from Bombardier in 2020. In 2010, Airbus announced a new variation of its best-selling narrowbody called the A320neo, short for New Engine Option, which promised a 15% less fuel burn than the previous generation. In 2011, Airbus had a record number of orders for 1,419 aircraft, more than double than the year before. That same year, American Airlines, which had been strictly a Boeing customer, put in an order for hundreds of these new planes. And in 2019, the A320 family surpassed the 737 in total orders.
Originally, the business case was for around 600 airplanes, and now we are up to 19,000.
Boeing's response to the more fuel-efficient A320 was the re-engined 737 MAX that debuted in 2017. But over the next few years, the manufacturer faced a series of challenges. In 2018 and 2019, 2 737 MAX 8s crashed and killed 346 people. It was later found a flight control system known as MCAS had malfunctioned on both flights. The planes were grounded for several months and production rates were reduced. Then the pandemic brought air travel to a halt, and the company had a record loss of $12 billion in 2020. Airbus saw losses of over $1 billion in both 2019 and 2020, but returned to profitability in 2021. But Airbus has consecutively had more annual orders and deliveries since 2019, making it the world's largest plane maker. Then in 2024, a door plug flew off of Boeing's 737 MAX 9 plane, leading to more production delays of its best-selling jet, and an annual loss of $11.8 billion in 2024.
Airbus has profited from the challenges that Boeing has faced. Some airlines decided to place orders with Airbus for aircraft rather than Boeing.
And if you look at Airbus's backlog today, it's dominated by A321.
Airlines looking to cut down on fuel costs have been turning to these more efficient, longer-range narrow bodies for longer flights like JFK to LA or the East Coast to Europe.
Of our single-aisle order book, or backlog as we call it, 72% are the Airbus 321, and that's opening up routes and markets that they couldn't fly directly before.
The economics with single aisles were so much better than the economics with wide bodies. And the Airbus A321neo wasn't perfect, but it was the biggest and best single aisle you could get, and leading Airbus to effectively a 60 or 65% market share from the standpoint of both deliveries and orders and backlog. It's become the hinge factor between the two.
Boeing doesn't really have a comparable airplane. The 737 MAX 9 isn't quite as big. The 10 is big, but it doesn't quite have the range. So where Airbus has done well in the market is they have a product that Boeing really doesn't have.
The 737 MAX 10 has a range of 3,100 nautical miles and can seat a maximum of 230 people, versus the A321neo, which has a range of 4,700 nautical miles and can seat 244 passengers. But the MAX 10 has yet to be certified.
The bad news is, given these delays, these many-year delays, and given the challenges, and also, frankly, you've got this attack on the administrative state in Washington. which is also toxic from Boeing's standpoint. These are resources they need to certify planes, and they're increasingly in short supply. So there's a lot about DOGE and the attack on the FAA and other administrative agencies that's really not all good from the standpoint of Boeing certification.
In 2024, Airbus delivered 766 planes, compared to Boeing's 348. Most of the revenue from aircraft is received on delivery. Boeing 737 MAX production has been capped at 38 planes a month since January 2024 by the Federal Aviation Administration. That rate was 52 planes a month prior to the pandemic and 2 MAX crashes. So far in 2025, it surpassed monthly delivery goals compared to last year. Airbus has faced production challenges too. It, like the rest of the industry, has been dealing with supply chain issues post-pandemic and an engine recall for many of its jets.
There was the Pratt GTF engine 2 years ago with the difficulties they encountered with the metal powder issue that is leading to a big recall campaign and that is limiting the number of engines going for new fit for us. Also last year, with production difficulties faced by CFM and their supply chain, that has led to a difficult end of 2024 and also some shortages at the beginning of this year.
Airbus deliveries have been lower compared to last year, but the company said it still expects to deliver 820 new planes by year end.
In the medium term, it's hard to see anything that stops Airbus from controlling that all-important mid-market segment. We're really talking about a battle for the 2030s here. The 2020s have been decided.
The industry could face other challenges like tariffs and a possible recession in the coming months.
For an industry that's thoroughly globalized, this is absolutely toxic. There's a lot about these tariffs we just don't know right now. But it's remarkable the extent to which the jetliner industry became a model of free trade, and the U.S. competed and absolutely did great with an enormous trade surplus, and that's now at risk. Now, as for the airplanes themselves, the majority of structures are indeed imported.
Even though Airbus now has manufacturing in Mobile, Alabama, it still imports parts like wings and fuselages.
The US exports 6 times more than it imports in aerospace products and components. And so the concern about a tariff regime is that is then going to impede in that supply chain, and it's going to add to the costs of the airplane.
More expensive airplanes could mean rising costs for the consumer. Both the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320 and their variations are newer interpretations of jets designed decades ago. The industry has been waiting for new technologies, engines, and designs to be introduced.
The A320 has been a platform that's been around for many decades. The next generation airplane will be a completely new platform. It's going to be based on new propulsion techniques, a new wing design, new materials, and also a more digitally enabled airplane. We hope to see that flying in the second half of the next decade.
It is so much more complex to design and build a new airliner today than it was decades ago. Airlines are struggling with what is the right design, what materials go into it, what engines do we use for it, what fuel powers it.
In 2022, Boeing's CEO at the time, Dave Calhoun, announced that it would not introduce a new airplane into the next decade.
So on that range and payload envelope, they've really got nothing that competes with the 321neo. They need a new jet. They absolutely need a new jet. And so that, of course, told people that they should go and order an A321neo, which they did. There were 1,300 sales in the following 12 months. So Dave Calhoun, in a lot of ways, was the very best CEO that Airbus ever had.
Airbus hasn't announced a new clean sheet plane either, but at a recent summit outlined what technologies could potentially power a new single-aisle aircraft. And despite Boeing's struggles, experts say it's not inevitable that Airbus's lead continues.
Airbus is just positioned better because they just have more latitude to kind of wait and see because of their product lineup today.
Right now things look fantastic, next 5 years at least. But eventually someone is going to disrupt them, and it might just be a resurgent Boeing. And for the first time in way over a decade, they actually have a really good leader at the helm.
Experts also say China's COMAC could enter the market.
If COMAC is able to make inroads in the West, especially if the Chinese government decides to subsidize the sale of those airplanes to get some sales, into Western airlines. That could introduce one of the most serious threats to both Airbus and Boeing that we have seen in a long time.
Brazil-based Embraer could also be a strong competitor to enter the narrow-body space. The company, which makes smaller regional and business jets, has been talked about as a company that could disrupt the duopoly.
I'd put my money on Embraer first. Embraer is a very, very capable company, good engineers.
If Boeing doesn't do a competitive response, then again, the 321neo becomes the hinge of fate. Obviously, in the long run, a lot can go wrong with that. It's your classic innovator's dilemma. Why would you disrupt yourself when you're the overwhelmingly dominant player on the market? So will something change? It must. Entropy, right? But until then, Airbus gets 2/3 of the market, which is not at all bad.